And Crittendon. You guys are lucky. This is another powerful speaker that you're about to hear from. Anne Crittendon is an award-winning journalist, author, and lecturer. Her latest book, If You've Raised Kids, You Can Manage Anything, received critical praise and was featured in People magazine. Her previous book, The Price of Motherhood, garnered widespread media attention and was named one of the New York Times Notable Books of the Year in 2001. It's now in its 20th anniversary edition. I just want you to know that no book I've ever written has had a 20th anniversary edition. The book is already being called a classic. It already is a classic, Anne. A women's magazine editor wrote recently, if The Feminine Mystique was the book that laid the seeds for the women's movement of the 60s, The Price of Motherhood may someday be regarded as the one that did the same for the mothers' movement. Crittendon was a reporter for the New York Times for 8 years, writing on a broad range of economic topics. She initiated numerous investigative reports and was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. She has also been a financial writer and foreign correspondent for Newsweek, a reporter for Fortune magazine, a visiting lecturer for MIT and Yale, an economics commentator for CBS News, and executive director of the Fund for Investigative Journalism. Her previous books include Sanctuary, A Story of American Conscience and the Law in Collision, one of the New York Times notable books in 1988, and Killing the Sacred Cows, Bold Ideas for a New Economy. Her articles have appeared in every national newspaper and numerous magazines, including Foreign Affairs, The Nation, Barron's, and Working Woman. Crittendon is a native of Dallas, Texas, and is a graduate of Southern Methodist University and the Columbia University School of International Affairs. She completed all of the work except for the dissertation for a PhD in Modern European History from Columbia. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has served on the board of the International Center for Research on Women. She's married, has one son, and lives in Washington, D.C. Please give a welcome to Anne Crittendon.
Thank you, Valerie. I appreciate that long introduction. It makes me feel really old having done all that. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here and speaking in such distinguished company. I was going to say I'm the only reporter here. I think there's one other fellow here who was a reporter. But being the only non-academic reminds me of a story I heard years ago when I was at Fortune. Apparently back in the 60s, one of our top writers went down to Princeton to interview John von Neumann, who was a Hungarian, a brilliant mathematician and physicist. As soon as our correspondent sat down, the great man sighed and said, "Oh, what can I say to a reporter?" Anyway, while we're preparing this talk, I wondered, what can I say after these specialists have given us their thoughts based on decades of really serious research? So I'm going to give you some very impressionistic anecdotes, personal observations that may not be quite as impressive, but at least here goes. I have thought about these issues. The first thing I do want to tackle, though, is the use of the phrase we saw on the screen and repeatedly, global birth strike. I have enormous problems with that phrase. I think it's totally inaccurate. There is nothing global about the low fertility, the low replacement rates, because all of sub-Saharan Africa, I think to the surprise of demographers, is still reproducing at a very, very rapid rate. Just to give you some idea of those who may not know, Nigeria, we have a Nigerian person here. Nigeria is the same size as Texas. Texas has a population of 30 million people. Nigeria has a population of 230 million, and that is expected to double in the next 23 years. Or take Tanzania. The population of Tanzania was 9 million people in 1970, and it is now 60 million, more than France, equivalent or a little more than France. And I was in Tanzania a few months ago, and let me tell you, the number of people is already having a very serious impact on the rivers. They're drying up. The wildlife is being killed, eaten for bushmeat. They were taught in school for years, breed, 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 have large families to make up for the losses of the slave trade. We would be as populous as China if they hadn't dragged us off in chains, school children were taught. So there is an explosion actually going on in Africa. It's estimated to add 3 billion new people in the next 70 years. And I think this probably explains a good deal of the legitimate concern in Europe because according to a number of polls I've seen, half of Africans want to leave the continent. And where's the first place they're going to go? They're going to go to Europe, probably. And it is a very real concern about the, I mean, we've seen already what immigration fears have done. Interestingly, I also had a personal experience of this with Brexit. I was in England a couple of times while Brexit was being debated. And we had dinner one night in a home county. A wealthy white family had us for dinner. And the host was a very big supporter of Brexit, leaving the EU, England leaving the EU, or UK leaving the EU. And I asked him why. What did he expect to get out of that? And he said, oh, God, he said, there's so many Nigerians coming in. Well, the last time I looked, Nigeria wasn't part of the EU, and this isn't going to affect it. But that fear of the immigration of the other is driving a lot of our fears about migration and so forth. So that's one point. The other point is, of course, has been alluded to, a global birth strike. There is no strike going on around by mothers or by women. A strike, oh, where's my note? A strike implies a concerted, conscious action with clearly defined goals and objectives, while the decision on when and where or how many children to have is the most intensely personal and private decision a person can make. However, thinking about it, I do believe there is a strike going on in the U.S. right now, particularly, and that is among people who take care of, educate, and take care of young children, child care workers. I'm not sure this is people are quite aware of this massive withdrawal or strike from the labor force. In the U.S., there are now 100,000 fewer child care workers, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and some 16,000 fewer child care programs than before the pandemic. There's a huge exodus going on, and I just this week heard some economic statistics about employment and this and that without any mention of this massive labor withdrawal. It's almost as if economists don't want to look at that we've seen of almost disappearance of much of the child care industry. And why is this happening? Well, the typical child care worker, we heard an earlier reference to babysitters make $16 to $20 an hour. The typical worker in child care makes $13 an hour. Nobody can survive on that. They stocking shelves at Target, ringing up groceries at Trader Joe's, packing boxes at Amazon, and cleaning houses in Washington all pay more. In fact, everything pays more. 98% of occupations pay more than child care. And I had another interesting illustration of this. I was hiking in West Virginia about a year ago. And when we stopped for lunch at a barbecue shop, we saw a poster advertising jobs at a nearby correctional institution. It said, no experience necessary, high school degree required, that was it, and it paid $32 an hour. So in this country, we have more respect and more remuneration for working with criminals than working with children. And I might add, the same labor shortage exists in nursing homes and in residential care. The entire care industry has lost almost 500,000 jobs since February 2020. So the child care shortage has had one huge first level effect. It has pushed massive numbers of women out of the labor market. They can't work anymore because there's nobody to take care of the kids. In a late summer Census Bureau household survey, more than 1.3 million people reported that an adult in their household had left a job because they had to take care of children under the age of 5. Another massive movement of workers out of the labor force. Until the late 90s and early 2000s, the U.S. had a higher percentage of women in the labor force than most other developed countries. Today, we lag almost all of the other developed countries in the percentage of women, including educated women, who are no longer working for pay. So we have to ask, what is going on and why are we pushing productive workers out in the prime of life, including many highly educated people, out of the labor force, especially when we have a lower than replacement level fertility rate, leading toward a future shortage of workers? What sense does that make? And obviously, the scarcity and high cost of daycare is also preventing many women from having the second or third child they might like to have. A Washington Post columnist recently wrote that her young daughter's daycare costs more than her mortgage and more than double the undergraduate tuition of the flagship state university nearby, and would basically be cheaper to send the girl to law school than to daycare. But her 16-year-old isn't quite ready yet for graduate school. Her conclusion, and remember, this is a relatively highly paid person, professional, thank God I don't have a second child. So this is an effect that is certainly discouraging childbirth. Finally, the child care crisis has not only reduced our labor force and is preventing many women from having the number of children they might want, it's also holding back the learning opportunities of disadvantaged children. In short, we are stunning the productivity and the life chances of our future workers. So it's, pretty shocking to many people. How has the strike, Valerie asked once in talking to the speakers, have we had any leverage from the strike? And I'm seeing the strike in this sector. And how has this massive labor market flux created any leverage for change? Well, we saw that it has none very recently. Every single Republican, along with one Democrat, blocked President Biden's plan to expand access to subsidized child care and raise pay in the sector to $15 an hour. That lone Democrat was Joe Manchin of West Virginia, the very same state where untrained correctional officers make almost 3 times as much as the people who teach young children. So child care was dropped out of the stimulus plan, and there has been no federal discussion of it since. So U.S. in many ways today is moving toward industrial policy in semiconductors. We see it elsewhere. But we have no industrial policy for the care and early education industry. It's very rarely thought of as an industry, and there's no question this reflects a male bias. Good jobs are the manly, blue-collar jobs in construction, manufacturing, charging stations, mining, and prisons, not the pink-collar jobs in early child care and education that produce our productive workers of the future. You could call child care the most neglected, broken infrastructure in the nation. I called it in my book, The Price of Motherhood, the dark matter in the universe of work, because it is so invisible to so many men in power. So a feminist agenda would certainly do something about this, and would give many more choices to women. I've also said in the book, this business of she had a choice. She had a choice to raise a child, so why is she complaining about the consequences? But we don't have very many good choices between work and family, particularly in the United States, where we have very, very small, inadequate social safety net or child support policies, family support policies, if you will. So where do I go from here? I could list a lot of a feminist agenda that would make raising children easier, that would make children less onerous, and put another way that would share the costs, the social costs of raising kids. So we can mention a few of these just for starters. one of the things that people, you saw on Ms. Shuba's list of why women said they didn't want to have children or were worried about having them, a big one was time. I don't have time. And we, of course, you may know Americans work longer hours now than people in almost any other developed country. So there's very little time. And the other countries have done something about that. In Sweden, a parent can opt for a 6-hour day until their children are 8 years old. That's by the law. And I've interviewed people in Sweden, and they said it's really wonderful to negotiate with your boss when you have the law on your side. They have to grant that 6-hour day. In the Netherlands, the official work week is 36 hours, and workers have the right to a 4-day week. And very importantly, in the Netherlands and several other places, the shorter work week is paid at the same hourly rate and has the same benefits, including vacation time, sick leave, pension rights, et cetera, as a full-time job prorated for the amount of hours that are included. Rules like this prevent the incentive that employers now have in the US to hire non-standard workers on cheap, exploitative terms. Japan, by the way, during the pandemic also mandated this equal pay for equal work rule. And the EU recommends it for all the member states. Back to the Netherlands, almost half of the jobs are part-time, and part-timers enjoy all these benefits that I mentioned on a prorated basis. Most of these part-time jobs are women's pink-collar jobs, care, education, service jobs, and 70% of women there work part-time. So, and they've, you might add, chosen to do that. So it looks like women have freer choice than women here and a little bit less onerous constraints on raising children. But at the same time, the paradox exists. The fertility rate in the Netherlands is 1.55%, one of the very lowest you can find. So there's no magic formula. You can make life easier, and I recommend it, and make child rearing less expensive, but it doesn't necessarily move the fertility rates. On the other hand, the opposite is true. In flexible working conditions, which were much more inflexible when I had my one child 40 years ago, it pushed me out of the job market for a long time. It pushed people out of the job market. It pushed many people in my generation not to have children at all. In the book, I call it another mommy tax is childlessness, has been childlessness. The educated baby boomer women did not have, apparently, as many children as they might have wanted to have. Fully 1/4 of educated baby boomers in America never had children. They, or we especially, who went into business or some of the more demanding professions like law, journalism, had to follow a be a man strategy, operating professionally as if they had no responsibilities, no family responsibilities at all. Fortunately, that has changed, and it is now a lot easier to be in a profession. Accounting profession led the way on that, I might add. But it has not necessarily produced a higher fertility rate. What else would be on a primary caregiver's wish list? A big one, and I think it was mentioned earlier, would be giving credit towards Social Security for the years spent caregiving. At the moment, I'm sure you may know, nannies earn Social Security credit toward their pension. A person working at home with a young child, or any sick, disabled adult, is credited with a 0 for every year they spend in that caregiving labor. 0. So having a baby, I think one can safely say, is probably the single biggest risk factor for poverty in old age, because your pension is permanently lower. I have friends who raised 2 kids, spend a lot of time at home, who get $800, $900 a month in Social Security. Try living on that. And what about divorce? This is usually never discussed, but fairer divorce laws would make life a lot easier for the primary caregiver. Every family member, I did a lot of research on divorce, and most people, when I went around the country speaking about all these issues, didn't want to talk about it because they never thought it would happen to them. I had a person write me, email me, that their book group in Atlanta read my book. I had 3 chapters on spousal support, child support, different division of assets, all these things happening after divorce. And they said, we don't want to read it because we're all married. Well, half of them may not be by now, but anyway. Everybody's worse off after divorce, but the primary caregiver and the children are worse off of all. Study shows, this is recent, a study I might add, that wives' financial dependence on husbands increases substantially after the arrival of a child, irrespective of their education level or their cohort or their profession. In other words, mothers, because they cut back on paid work, have much, much lower earning power than their husbands and become vastly more vulnerable economically after having a child and after the divorce. This is called the opportunity cost that Nancy referred to, the lost income and the lost prospects. Part of the problem, just briefly, is that legally in America there's no such thing as family income. When most couples get married, they pool their resources and they call it their family income. And that's what it is while they are married. But the rule on earnings legally is he who owns it earns it, or she who earns it owns it. And after a divorce, you can take that with you, your salary, your earning power. What you earn is yours, unless a judge orders you to give some of it to the children or the ex-spouse who is raising the children. So surely that should be, or probably is to some degree, a deterrent to women having very many children. And it also totally reflects male power, because I have seen, you can do the research is there, that the state legislatures make divorce laws. And interestingly, in the states where women make up a higher percentage of the state legislature, like Washington State, divorce laws and family laws better protect primary caregivers. And in states in which males dominate the state legislature, Pennsylvania, very notably, it is the opposite, that many more women end up on welfare after divorce. Okay, what else can we say here? I think one of the things, generalizing on all this, is that these measures would all make raising children a far greater cost to men than it is today. Now, whether that would have a deterrent effect on fertility, it would balance, right? The men would want less kids, and the women might want a few more. So I'm not sure it would have a big effect. You might be curious about the balance of power between the sexes in Texas politics. Well, my home state is currently 35th out of the 50 states in the percentage of women in the state legislature. Texas is the bottom 26% in 2021 in women in legislative power. As far as the Supreme Court, only 2 of the 9 justices are women. So it's safe to say this is a male-dominated state with rules designed by and for men, which gets us to the abortion issue, which has to be at the heart of any discussion of a feminist approach to reproduction. This very male-dominated state has created one of the most restrictive abortion bans in the country. We've come a long way backwards since 1992, when Ross Perot, an independent presidential candidate from Texas, when asked on national TV debate what was his position on abortion, he said, "Let the women decide." I would just point out that reproductive freedom is not what many politicians think it is, a woman's issue separate from other important economic issues. Determining the size and timing of your family is one of the most profound economic decisions a person can make in their lifetime. The cost of raising a child we have seen today is gigantic and way larger than many people think. When my book first came out, Business Week gave a full-page review to the book with this title, which kind of shocked me because I'd never said it directly. Welcome to America, where having a baby is the worst financial decision you can make. But here's what some studies have found. A woman's wages increase for every year she delays motherhood. If you have access to abortion, your probability of graduating college increases by 72%. This was from a Congressional Joint Economic Committee report titled "Abortion Access is Key to Economic Freedom." When she is unable to obtain an abortion, a woman's debt increases according to a paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. And women were in comparatively worse financial shape 5 years later after childbirth. All of this which helps explain why women are having babies later in life. And what about the children? Abortion rights are about their well-being as well. The children of women who live in states with access to abortion are less likely to experience poverty or need federal assistance than children living in states without that access. Romania was mentioned, a place where abortion was strictly outlawed for a long time, and where the children were born and put into orphanages, totally neglected and completely stunted in their development. It was a human rights shock, very, very grim result. So if national security depends on the health and personal security of all of its citizens, then punishing people who want to decide how many more mouths to feed is frankly crazy. So finally, I have to bring up the environment. I want to suggest that what kind of world are we asking people to have children in? What kind of society would women want to reproduce if they could create their own environment, an environment to their key? And I would suggest that women would be much more likely to be protecting the environment if they could. I just made a list of all the bad news that came out in the last month on the environment. A lot has come out recently because this week there is an international conference in Egypt on global climate change. That is a global thing. I just thought of some of them, though, that might really resonate with child rearing. One is the huge decline in wildlife populations and the massive disappearance of species. We're in what's been called the sixth great extinction of other species, except for our species. I thought if I did one graph, it would be the human population and the animal population. What's happening to the elephants, the tigers, virtually everything. Birds, animals, insects. You've all heard about the insect test on the windshields. We don't get smash bugs on the windshields anymore. The insect populations are plummeting. The bird populations are plummeting in the United States and Europe where it's being measured. And all of these are creatures that we read about in the baby books. If you remember reading the books to your children, they're all about the little animals, all these little animals and birds. And what will we read to them when all the animals are gone? We're destroying them. And again, my trips to Africa, I've been more than half a dozen times, you see it happening. You see massive fewer elephants, giraffes, the bushmeat trade. They're eating giraffes. They're killing them. It has to do with population. They're drying up the rivers to dam the rivers to bring water to their cities that are exploding. China killed all its birds decades ago. Going on and on. The various national disasters. So it's hard to say. I won't say that everybody who's going to be a prospective parent is aware of each and every item on climate change, on global warming, global storms, hurricanes, floods, high heat. But you would have to be an insentient being to have missed the overall message that our Earth is changing, and not for the better, and not for a better future for the children. You can see this in art. I was at the Venice Biennial a few weeks ago. The two greatest shows were in the Doge's Palace, Anselm Kiefer, the great German painter. It was a holocaust of pictures. The other great show was Anish Kapoor, the Indian-born British sculptor, who had two exhibits in two different palaces filled with blood and gore. And I mean, this was seriously scary stuff. And my husband said, I think these two guys are telling us they're worried about the future. You see it in the apocalyptic films, you see it in the fiction, you see it in the zombie vampire movies. A 2020 novel, A Children's Bible, explicitly asks what kind of world are parents leaving their children? And the answer is an apocalypse. And there's more and more evidence, I think, that people are thinking twice. You can find it on Facebook. There is a group called Conceivable Future expressing this concern. There's a group based in Canada called No Future, No Children. And yes, there's one in America called Birth Strike. Not too many members, but all questioning the wisdom of bringing a child into the world and calling for climate action. A recent survey found that 38% of 18 to 29-year-old Americans believe that a couple should consider the risks of climate change before having kids. A BBC survey of 8 to 16-year-olds found that nearly 3/4 were, quote, deeply worried about the state of the planet. And a study published November 2021 in the journal Climate Change found that, quote, climate anxiety, close quote, was factoring into reproductive decisions of 607 Americans between the ages of 27 and 45. The American Psychological Association, by the way, defines climate anxiety as a chronic fear of environmental doom. Fully 96.5% of the people on the last poll quoted in Climate Change were very or extremely concerned about a child's well-being in a climate-compromised world. And I see it among my age cohort where all my friends are really kind of worried about the fate of their grandchildren. It's out there. So in conclusion, I want to suggest that a world which we would, if we had the power to design it, would be a marshaling of all our forces to protect the planet, to concern ourselves with planetary security rather than national security. Because believe me, we're all in this together. We need to make this earth a better place for mothers, which means we need to put Mother Earth in a better place. Thank you. No questions. Makes it easy. So we have an early, yeah.
Yes. So do you think culture has to see it's like a difference between like the birth rates? Because Latin America is also not having problems with the birth rates right now. So I just wonder if you think culture is like an issue in these birth rates.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Does culture have an impact on fertility?
Yes.
Well, how do we answer that? We see this trend is almost universal except for sub-Saharan Africa or a couple of places where women are truly without education or opportunity. It's higher in Pakistan maybe or Afghanistan at the moment. So that's across culture. It has low fertility rates have crossed culture. They're global. Yeah.
Thank you.
And as you know, I could go on, but I've also seen a lot of interesting. We didn't talk about some of the different national strategies that are fascinating in Sweden and Japan, who both faced a low birth. There's a lot of fun stories about the demography of this, but I don't think culture really is the determinant. Yeah.
Thank you.
For family policy. It's so discouraging. They were 100% against the child allowance. It's insane to me, but I shouldn't say that. Look, that's why my book is still in print after 20 years, because there has been so little movement on these issues. And I thought one of the things that would change dramatically, I was sure, would be paid parental leave. It's such a, you know, in America, everyone here knows I'm certain, there is no such thing as a federal paid parental leave. And of course, the lowest paid people have no right to any paid leave after childbirth, or if you're the other parent. And as a result, of course, mothers have to go back to work in a week after childbirth, or they lose their jobs and they go into poverty. And it hasn't changed much. There is still no federal paid leave. I thought child care would change. And it was very interesting when this new presidential administration came in. The Council of Economic Advisors included women, head of the council, who knows all about this. They produced that economic report. They said, you know, this is in the national interest, the economic interest, blah, blah, blah. And he had it in the bill, a very nice child allowance. And we did see the big bill that supported us all from being hungry, or most people, during the pandemic, had a child allowance. So children would not go hungry when their parents could not go to work. And the minute you had the data out of that, you saw child poverty in America plummet. It was the best policy we had ever had. That has not, there are no plans to extend that policy. It's going out. So I'm not optimistic. I mean, unless women get in the street, I'm very inspired by women in Iran, but how successful they'll be, we'll not see. But American women are not really activated that much. And I did a lot of speaking to women, and I think there is a lingering feeling that they don't really deserve help, that there is this, and it's strong in Texas, that attitude that I'm a tough person, whatever they throw at me, I can deal with it, I'm not asking for favors, I can take care of myself, and they don't really feel they're entitled to a child allowance or to fair distribution of the cost. And it's holding them back, I think. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
First, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I do have a question for you. Is there a correlation between fertility rates and the various religions of the world?
And marriage what?
Religions.
Marriage provision.
Religions.
Oh, in religions.
Yes. Is there
Interesting. No, I
any
don't know of any.
any
Let me
connection?
take a minute. You know, the rules of marriage in this country are state by state. So family law has always been not national law. So it's hard to get a lot of data about it. And different marriages by religion, well, you want to make a guess? I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it. You're asking maybe, what about Saudi Arabia? What about the Muslim law? I don't know. I was rather fascinated. I've looked at Iran, and they have abortion. Actually, Sharia law allows it after 20 weeks. That's when that religion says there is viable life. And it's still not automatic, but a woman can get an abortion after 20 weeks in this very Ayatollah country. I don't know, on other religious, I don't think, whatever, Christians and Jews don't differ that much on it. Anyway, okay, thank you.